I'm Marlo, 47, and I live with my kid in a modest home tucked away in the suburbs of Asheville, North Carolina, with lots of shaded trees work as a nurse, which is a demanding but steady career, and following years of being I've learned to live alone as a single mother because I got home late that evening, off a long shift, and was too exhausted to do anything but lie down and change into my pajamas. My son, who was almost 19 years old, perhaps he was studying or doing something else in his room, but I'm never sure. It's been just the two of us since my husband Cullen departed 8 years ago. There hasn't been any argument or adultery. He's just went away like morning dew in the sun. I regret it, but I don't blame him. Was 11 at the time, and I was finding it difficult to be both a mother and a father, so it decided to stay with me, and we created our own world together. It was basic, but intimate. I was asleep when I opened my eyes to a very faint knock, believing I was dreaming, but suddenly the sound of Mom Thigh's deep little voice came back as if I couldn't sleep. So I sat up and called softly since I was terrified of damaging something. The door was ajar that was standing beneath the hallway with light shoulders and slouched, unlooking eyes. I caressed the empty space, whispering, "I just want to be close to you." It entered the area next to the bed like a shadow resting on. It sighed. I could sense something weighing on the wall when I wasn't playing or studying. "Do you want to say something?" asks an anonymous tired person who is playing games too late. I said softly, "Just be here." And it shook its head. That statement warmed my heart. Clinch was taller than me, and no longer the needy youngster he once was. His voice was deeper than his father's at the same age, but he appeared to have reverted to the I reached out to the child who used to rest his head on my shoulder in the middle of the night when he had a stomachache, and softly rubbed his hair. The old habit came back to him instinctively. His eyes. His breathing slowed as he closed his eyes, and the room fell silent. Yet something else, not terror or wrongness, was present. Sensations that were just too intimate. And when his hand lightly stroked mine beneath the blanket, I briefly considered pulling away. But I refrained, as I understood that both he and I were merely attempting to locate a support system. We didn't exchange words or give each other a hug, but in that dimly lit area between our taking deep breaths, I could feel an emotion that I dared not express. Name a line that started to blur, not because they were purposefully crossing it, but rather because being too close for too long could cause things to return to normal tomorrow morning. But that evening, I just lay still beside my son, in a tiny cottage shrouded in mist and an autumn wind. On the next morning, when I woke up earlier than normal, I felt wetter downstairs than as usual. They were still in the room when I heard the bathroom faucets running. I was standing there, cooking the first pancakes on a hot pan when the door creaked open and he entered the kitchen. His favorite was the crispy-edged variety that was scented with cinnamon and butter. I tried to seem upbeat when I said, "Hey honey, are you hungry?" since he was a child. He nodded as he passed the pancakes across the table and sat down, eating, in silence with his fork in hand. The distance between us there is now a different kind of silence instead of the cozy silence that existed before. There was something that both of us didn't want to touch that was still there. I pretended to look away from him while browsing through my phone, but when he reached for the syrup, his hand touched mine. For a moment, I felt myself freeze. I grinned and pulled my hand away as though after breakfast, we left as usual and I cleaned up while he went to his room to study. However, during the day, nothing had transpired. For a very long time, I couldn't stop thinking about how he looked at me that morning. Not like a boy, but like a man. Love. But there was something in between that afternoon that was difficult to identify. When Avis visited, she was the type of woman who could get people to listen attentively with just a few words. She was once I worked as a nurse in the same clinic as her, and she now owns a used bookstand on Main Street where she offers free tea and guidance. Had 2 cups of black tea, and listened to soothing music on a little Bluetooth speaker while sitting in the kitchen as usual. "How's what? Are they doing?" she inquired while drinking tea. Still the same? She studied quietly. Lots of people stay up late, I said, gazing out the window. Avis was quiet for a while, then exhaled gently. The other day, while seated on the sofa, I noticed him resting his head on your shoulder. He seemed adorable, although it seemed a bit long, and I was a little taken aback when I turned around. Even you know I don't judge, but I'm a mother. I had a son, she went on. No matter how close a mother and son are, there are some things you must maintain. Bounds, particularly when he's grown up. I didn't say anything to refute it, but I wasn't. As I was about to accept, Avis placed her hand on mine and said, I know. I understand that he's all you have left, but don't allow him to become too much of a burden. Reliant on you, since you'll lose it if he has to depart one day. We had dinner and watched together that evening, but I didn't say anything to them, because the lyrics made me cry. A movie is normal, but I started to notice everything differently. Gesture, the way his hand was on the chair close to mine, the way he cocked his head in my direction as he laughed. When he assumed I wasn't looking, he glanced at me discreetly, and I recognized that someone else had altered it. It was me as well. After they went upstairs that night, I sat by myself in the kitchen. An old Carole King song was playing softly in the background, while I held a glass of white wine. A tune that brought back memories of my time as a married person, when I believed I would lead a straightforward and contented existence. I missed Cullen, but not because I wanted him back, but rather because I missed something different about myself. I had no idea at the time how losing a husband or son, who is the object of someone's affection, might make you feel so hazy. I recall the day Cullen said goodbye without crying. With his hands in his pockets and a single, succinct sentence, he stood on the porch without any drama. I'm sorry, Marlo, but I don't feel anything anymore. Then he abandoned all that was. My amazement, the house, the debts, and the boy whose voice had just suddenly. Perhaps things changed after that day, and they and I started to create something, distinct from the typical mother-son bond. Too close, too essential, and too familiar to realize it was intensifying. The following morning, I reminded them to contact Cullen for an update about school, but he was silent for Kurt Lee. I don't want to talk to him because he's still your father, I said after a moment. Softly, they glanced at me and said, Cullen has a right to know you're okay. When you were ill and the home leaked, Dark didn't give a damn about you. And Mom couldn't sleep since she didn't have the money to fix the heater that was there when your mother came to get you from your awful. I was shocked that Dreams wasn't him, even though I knew he was upset with his father. When I was packing things in the afternoon, I never saw him feeling envious of the past. I was shocked when Leora Thier's ex-girlfriend answered the phone in the garage. She spoke softly and courteously. Miss Marlo. I only wanted to know if Thier was all right. Hasn't replied to any of my letters and hasn't texted me since our breakup. So, I'm a little anxious. I took a deep breath and assured Leora that I hadn't done anything wrong. Perhaps your son is an introvert and isn't ready to let people in, but I simply believe that he wants only your voice, Leora's, to be heard. Wandered off that evening when I was preparing dinner, entering the kitchen and leaning their palms against the doorframe. I nodded to you without turning around while you were speaking to Leora's mother in his pockets. Should respond to her, since we were in love, and they fell silent before moving. I looked back as he lowered his voice and said, Mom, I don't want anyone else to come in. His speech was calm, his eyes were deep, but there was something, so I truly believe that you are the only person who can relate to me, and I don't need anyone else. You can't be everything. I whispered in a quiet voice, but my heart is squeezed. He stared at me for a long time, like in prayer. What if I don't want anyone? However, I didn't immediately respond, because the inquiry seemed like a little deeply piercing dagger in my heart, not bleeding. The head resting on my shoulder that night made me feel less at ease than usual as we watched the movie. The hand that was placed next to mine on the chair was no longer haphazard. The quiet that lingered between us was no longer a pause, but rather something that I couldn't identify, that was about to blow up, feeling, and I was terrified that I would be mistaken, even if it was just in my. Our relationship was less pure than it had been, and the worst thing was that we neither of us said anything inappropriate that evening, but we both understood that. We didn't bring up the distance between me and the physically close had started to expand in my thoughts, and even more concerningly, it had started. To demonstrate in his eyes, I called Cullen 3 days later, not because I was missing him, and most definitely not because I required him, but rather because I believed they needed an anchor other than me. He responded on the. His voice is as courteous but non-committal as before on the third ring. How are you, Marlo? I felt you should visit Thier, who is home and doing well. But there was a pause before Cullen I breathed. I'm not sure if he wants to see you, but he's still my son. Left it as that. A straightforward call with no emotion or room for interpretation. But after I hung up, and when I glanced around, I found Thier standing there, staring at me. How long had he been there? I wasn't upset. I wasn't asking questions. But something seemed different. Like I had. He violated an unwritten agreement between us. Do you still speak with him? The gentle, non-accusatory tone of her voice occasionally made me feel worse. He nodded slowly to see how I was doing, and I thought, you didn't need anyone else. I didn't dare to answer, and the words fell into the air like a stone into a silent lake. He sat closer to me than usual that night while we watched the movie. Occasionally, he turned to face me, his eyes deep and contemplative, and I stood. When the film was over, he delicately stroked my arm just enough to stop me from getting up to do the dishes. Do you recall the year we were stranded in the car in the snow? Yes, I slept in your arms the entire time the car died. He grinned distantly that day, and my hair was a little frozen in the morning. I wondered if the world was about to end. When I was a young girl, I turned away, concealing my eyes, thinking that simply having you embrace me would be sufficient. And she asked, but I didn't respond. The following morning, I met Leora once again. I hadn't intended to visit the small bakery where she worked on the weekends, but when I noticed the familiar wavy hair, and as I entered through the glass door, seemingly attracted by something outside, she gave me a sincere little smile. Hello, Leora. How are you? I was just thinking about the sad smile, Miss Marlo. I nod occasionally, and he thinks about me too, but he's not sure how to express it. Leora glanced at me hesitantly, asking if I could be honest. I looked up, feeling as though I knew what was going to happen, yet I feel as though they forbid anyone from being close to him, as he has committed himself to just one person. And is that you? Stood there momentarily in awe of the query posed by a 20-year-old girl in the middle of the day, surrounded by the scent of I left the bakery with melting butter and pastry ringing in my chest like a bell. Day, with my mind racing, Leora hadn't made any mistakes or spoken anything offensive. Accusations that put me in a situation where no one else was, and she had just brought up something I had avoided, could intervene, and the most terrifying part was that I had allowed it to occur. That night, he came out of his room with a cup of tea and sat down across from me while I was putting books away in the living room. We remained silent for a while before he gently inquired, Have you ever wondered if you would have been happy if things had gone differently? I tried to figure out what you mean. They shook their heads, saying that if you hadn't been divorced, I put down the book and stared into his eyes when you were with someone other than me. I've never felt like you were do you consider me as a support system? Burdened son? He questioned without blinking. After he returned to his room, I sat by myself for a while without responding. Time on the table beneath a stack of outdated textbooks. I discovered an ancient. He used the black ink pen I had to write down spontaneous tunes in a leather notebook, the type of music book. I didn't plan to read it when I gave it to him 2 Christmases ago, but my hand opened it. The one who always remains, the melody, was an unfinished song that seemed to have the solution I was trying to escape. Was straightforward, with a few notes strewn throughout, but the lyrics made me stop. You are the first. You are not a mother, a lover, or anything else I can relate to. So break the hand that held me when everything came apart. You are the location I cannot leave. But I dare not remain there indefinitely. My heart was racing when I closed the book. But it wasn't fear. Acknowledgement. They no longer gaze at me with childlike eyes, and I understand we had spent so much time in a world where we were the only two of us, and he no longer had the purity of a mother around him. All of the feelings were bottled up, including loneliness and the need to be heard. That night, as I was getting into bed, I heard a gentle knock that said, "Come in," and neither of us understood where the limits were anymore. The door opened, and Thea entered without asking, and his eyes were no longer. There was hesitation, but there was only one thing: honesty. He muttered, "I can't sleep," and I nodded, knowing that he had taken a seat on the side of the bed. There was a lengthy pause before he murmured quietly, "I know," with his hands on the blanket. "This shouldn't be happening, but I can't act as though it isn't since I feel this way. About anybody else but you." And I choked, my heart constricted. Gently interrupted me. "I don't need your permission or your response. I only wanted to let you know that I took the initiative to put my hand on his for the first time without trying to urge you. However, I said, I know you're the most beautiful thing in my life, and I won't allow anything to damage you because of it." He nodded. There were no dramas or tears, just the two of us, sitting in utter quiet, where boundaries and love clashed like two waves in. We didn't lie next to one another that night. Instead, we moved in different directions. He returned to his room, while I lay awake, gazing at the ceiling, admitting for the first time that certain emotions might become damaging if not handled appropriately. It causes people to lose their sense of self, and for a while, everything was as motionless as a lake in the Thea, and I maintained a more organic distance in the early hours of the morning following that evening. Inadvertent touches, no more lingering looks, but nothing significant actually occurred. Simply stepped aside and remained still in that area, acting as though that was sufficient, and on Saturday night, I was. When the phone rang while I was doing laundry, my gut told me to Marlo Gray's voice answered, "Yes, we're calling from the E. First ring." I took it up, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "Your son, Thea Gray, was recently taken to the downtown emergency room for a minor car accident. He is conscious and not in danger, but he requires medical help right away." My emotions were all shattered at once, and I dropped the shirt I was folding as my heart was racing like someone was squeezing my chest. He might have passed away, and I was unaware that I had reached the hospital at the age of 18. I sprinted into the chilly bright light, but it felt like I had been there for 18 years. I noticed Thea sitting on the hospital bed with a white bandage covering his forehead in the hallway. But I didn't have time to reflect on how I kept him close and prevented him from speaking. He simply muttered, "I'm fine, Mom," in a voice that trembled a little, pushing me away, which he attempted to conceal. But even though I wasn't in any pain, tears started to flow uncontrollably, not because they were wounded. However, the doctor indicated it was only a temporary situation since I felt like I was going to lose the most significant item in my life once more. A superficial wound required surveillance for a few hours before being allowed to return home that evening. I was thankful and held his hand by his bedside, just like I had done when he was a baby. A few minutes later, frightened Avis showed up with coffee and a stern expression on her face. "You're shaking," she observed, passing me the coffee as they dozed off on the pills while sitting next to me in the corridor. I said, never leaving the hospital door. I took it with both hands. I thought I was going to lose him. After sitting motionless for a while, Avis stated steadily and quietly, "No, Your more I turned to see how you looked, but she didn't look at me. Are you afraid of losing something more important than your child? It wasn't how I or any mother would have looked at my child when I was looking at him. I began to object. But my child, even though you may not have done anything illegal, you're moving in that path. When they woke up, I helped him up after realizing she was correct, and my throat clenched. His hand was around my shoulder, gently massaging it to get me to sip some water. It broke my heart to be normal with a lover, so I took him home. We didn't talk much at midnight, as it was lightly pouring, so I tucked him in. His hand stayed on his shoulder for longer than it ought to have, and he glanced at me. I leaned down to give him a forehead kiss since his eyes were so gentle and inviting, but my lips paused a few inches from his flesh, and I withdrew. I put my hands in my coat pockets and straightened up, saying, "Go to sleep. Mommy's in the next room," I murmured hastily before turning away. That night, I didn't cry, but I also didn't sleep. I just lay there with my eyes. I was outside in the dark, listening to the rain and my uncontrollably rapid heartbeat. I started to consider what I would do if Thier stopped viewing me as his mother one day. The following morning, we had breakfast as normal, but nobody touched one another or discussed the accident with anyone. Stated that there had been quiet between us the previous evening, and that Avis hadn't returned my "I don't blame you. I'm simply saying that I think you need some time, space, or both." 3 days. After the accident, they resumed his regular schedule, at least on the surface, but I'm beginning to feel afraid of myself. He arrived on time, studied 8, and assisted me with cleaning up, even taking the trash out to the... He stopped caressing me, and sitting near to me in the backyard without asking. But something had changed. He no longer gazed into my eyes as intently as he had on the sofa, which made me. One afternoon when I was watering the plants on the porch, something unsettling emerged. With his hands in his pockets and his hair slightly ruffled in the weak sunlight, "You're busy, Mom." I put down the watering can and couldn't figure out why he was silent for a while. Then, very slowly, he replied, "I spoke with a therapist at school. I was a little shocked, but I chose not to show it because of the accident. Felt as though my emotional focus was straying from you." Regarding his voice broke on the word "you." So I took a small step closer. And what did she answered? "You weren't crazy about that," with a slight smile. Occasionally, emotional upheaval is the body's defense mechanism against the loss that overconnection can cause. I nodded, thinking she was correct. She glanced at me and I thought, "Have you had felt anything like me?" I didn't respond immediately, and instead glanced down at I responded, as quiet as the wind I have, yet I looked up at the eyes that were begging for the truth from me. They nodded, and his eyes were sorrowful rather than angry. I never wanted it to happen, and I'm still working to keep it from getting worse. I've canceled all of my appointments with other people because I feel like I'm betraying them. I sat down on the stairs with a heavy heart, and I didn't betray you in any way. Our love isn't mine that way, and I'm not yours that way either. Sacrosanct, but it can't be a chain. He sat next to me and remained silent without making contact. After a while, they asked if you might accompany me to my next session. I don't think I could untie myself without you. I looked at him in the room and nodded. Perhaps I should also recover from the treatment. The area was basic and compact, with gray velvet chairs, soft yellow lighting, and the aroma of the counselor, Shelley, who was in her 50s, had peppermint oil hanging in the air. She sat down after shaking our hands with both hands while maintaining a calm yet steady stare. "I applaud you both for having the guts to come here," Shelley remarked in the chair across from us, turning to face us. We sat next to one another, not touching but close enough that everyone can enter a place as honest as this. Shelley began by asking basic questions about her recent mood and any changes since the accident, family ties, Everything appeared to be courteous dialogue until they said, I suppose, almost in a whisper, that I no longer recognize you as my mother. I turned to observe her, but Shell raised her hand a little to indicate that I shouldn't respond. Can you elaborate? She asked. I grew up My mother was the only person in the world when I was there, and they continued after my father departed. She was my wall when I was lonely, and my medicine when I was in pain. Was everything to me, but gradually I lost the ability to love everyone. She taught me everything I know about attachment, including my first feelings. Shelley turned to me, and I felt a part of me collapse, not from astonishment, but from understanding. What do you think, Ms. Marlo? I swallowed and then whispered, I feel bad because I've been the greatest mother I can be. Yet I might have placed my baby He ought not to have. Shelley nodded while he waited for me to go on. I'm lonely. Not in the sense that I need a man, but rather that I need someone to see me, and he never failed to notice that I was more than just a mother. I didn't request it, but I allowed him to be there for me when I needed him. I needed the proximity stay, so nobody talked for a little while before they squeezed his knees with his hands, saying, I don't want to hurt you. But if Shelley glanced at me and said, I don't leave because I think we'll both be consumed. It's a normal side effect of having such a strong attachment, not a negative emotion, so long in isolation. But if two individuals wish to maintain their love, they must. I nodded, my eyes stinging, and took the first hand to establish a healthy distance. Sometimes I have to spend some time apart from you, in order for us to both survive. They nodded separately, saying, I know and I will, but not because I don't. The session concluded in a knowing stillness with no one crying, because I need to be myself without you. There was just agreement and a pact between two souls who had approached the brink too closely, and nobody was upset. I discovered a folded piece of paper last night when I was packing Thier's room for an exchange semester trip to Vermont. Written by hand in a notebook. You are the place I always return to, but if I stay inside you, I folded the paper and placed it in my pocket because I know you want me to learn to walk. The room will be empty in a few days. So I sat down on his bed after checking his pocket. I cried for the first time, not because I was in agony, but rather because I was allowing Vermont welcome them with a little dusting of snow and a light, gray sky. Love lives its own life. I'd read all about the skies and the calm, charming college campuses, town's independent bookshops and welcoming coffee shops, which all appeared to, we didn't refer to it as a breakup, just time apart, but there are good places to start fresh, and I both understood that it was about re-establishing boundaries and resetting the relationship, not just about physical distance. It rained lightly enough to fog up the initial pillars of a connection we wished to maintain the night before. He went. The windows and stretch out the sound of the soft footfall in the kitchen. I was doing the dishes when they entered. I can't sleep, he muttered, clutching a small blanket and an old pillow that had belonged to him since he was 12. As if returning to that first evening following Cullen's departure, I nodded. No need to ask. I took her upstairs, and, in the darkness, I drew the covers up to the bed, where she lay down next to me without turning on the light. Since nobody had spoken or touched her in the hundreds of nights prior, there were only the steady heartbeats of the two individuals, resting beside her and the gentle patter of rain on the tin roof. Or after a long pause, they questioned, "Are you afraid?" I turned to her and said, "Are you afraid that you would go and then stop needing me?" The inquiry was sincere and not critical. Slowly replied, "No, I'm worried that you'll stay and then be unable to need anyone but me." There was a long pause before she muttered something so quiet that I missed her, the first person I ever loved. But I didn't want that love to deprive you of your loneliness. I reached out and caressed her hair, not as a mother nor as a person who could contain it anymore. A lady, but as an individual bidding farewell to a piece of her spirit. You are the most lovely thing in my life. but I don't want you to be the thing that causes me to lose my identity when I drive the next morning. The flight arrived at the airport around 6:25, and the streetlights were still dark, reflected off the windshield like light streaks moving across it. We didn't communicate much, but I did occasionally see her. I looked straight ahead while you looked at me in the rear-view mirror. He unbuckled his seatbelt as I came to a stop in front of the domestic terminal, his hands still in his lap as though he pulled a white envelope out of his pocket and said, "I'm writing you a letter." But he didn't want to open the door. I took the letter without opening it, but I nodded. "Read it, but wait until we get home," I murmured, trying not to tremble. Just squeeze his hand tightly and go. Find the part of me that I lost when I spent so much time with you. She nodded. No tears were shed, but I noticed her shoulders trembling a little as she turned to go, and I sat in the car for a little after she got in without starting it. The automobile just opened the envelope and took out the letter without crying. Even though she instructed me to, I used to believe that the handwritten letter, which was in blue ink, had slanted words like her mother's. That love was about holding on and not letting go. But I learned from you. Knowing when to back off and where the lines are to safeguard what is holy is what love is all about. You're not just you are the only person who has ever truly seen me, Mom, while I was nothing, which is why I had to learn to let you go in order to discover who I am. I'm not going anywhere. Just disappear, my darling, so that when I get back, I can stand in front of you as someone who is strong enough and special enough to love you, my son. The wind blew cold and genuine through the glass door's crevices as I folded the letter, but for the first time for many years, I felt light and not empty, as if I had just dropped a big stone. I turned the automobile around and placed it on the ground after carrying it for a long time. Even though Leora's bakery and the old gas station had the same familiar curves and were lit up, something inside of me had altered. He was no longer at my side, but I no longer had to worry about losing him because I now knew there were 5 years have gone by like a calm river, and those loves that are only real when released, ignoring but acknowledging that I still reside in the same Asheville home, which has been updated with a new roof and a painted front, lavender plants on the porch, and the door are small details. But they give the impression that haunted, they never returned, and he visited during vacations, making frequent calls and sending images from courses, vacations, a new partner, a redhead, named June, a humanities major who played the guitar, and I never pressed too hard and preferred to be quiet like him. I discovered that some things should be shared. When people are ready that morning, I sat on the front porch and prepared coffee, like I do every Friday. There were birds chirping and leaves rustling in the distance as I read the peaceful sky. When I went to fetch the mail, I noticed a familiar ivory envelope in the mailbox that had no postmark. Handwriting. I took a seat in the wooden chair, set down the coffee cup, and read the letter to my mother. It is precisely 5 o'clock today. I can still clearly recall the morning you dropped me off at the airport years ago. Your eyes were as brilliant as when I first started to walk without stumbling, even though you were wearing a gray coat and no makeup. I'm not. In addition to reminding you of what transpired, I'm writing to update you on all that has developed since. Then you mentioned that genuine love is knowing when to back off. More than any school instruction, I have grasped the significance of it during the last 5 years. You are the only one who has shown me love that is both delicate enough to make me want to leave it and strong enough to make me want to. I used to believe that I loved you improperly, but I now see that I should return when I am strong enough is not incorrect, but the fact that there isn't a model to describe how close you and I felt. The boundaries were hazy, yet that love restored our relationship and saved us both. I adore someone, and instead of feeling like I'm betraying you, June is aware of everything and is grateful for what you've done for me, patiently and faithfully. Specifics, but enough to grasp, and she stays put, saying, I know you love. I've never held that against you since your mother taught you how to love anything. It's just me for clinging to you so strongly. but I believe I had to experience that in order to mature. Married, little, and unsocial. Yet I want you to come as more than simply a mother. Your son, Thier, was the first to show me how to love with boundaries. Therefore, I put the letter down, and my hand tightened on my coffee cup as the sun rose higher, illuminating the steps. There was a slight silence in my heart, and I didn't cry, because there was no reason to. Not a burden anymore, but a place where everything that had occurred was still present. Not denied, but it was folded and put in the memory drawer like I dried the old handkerchief that had been wet with tears and got up to walk inside. Opened a drawer and removed the ancient wooden box containing all of the letters. From the Mother's Day card he had written to me at the age of 8 in sloppy handwriting to the note he had. When he departed for Vermont, I carefully put the most recent letter inside before giving him a brief phone call. Minutes, I just said, "Mommy's coming, and I'm really proud of you." They took a while to respond, but I could hear her breathing steadily and no longer trembling. "Thank you." Mom remarked that I should know when to stop and do everything. That night, I sat on the porch once more, with the moon high and the wind blowing softly across the table beside me. There was a picture from an old photo album of a 4-year-old boy with a smudged face and a gray coat embracing me around the neck. With whipped cream grinning broadly, I gazed at the picture for a while. I whispered to myself, even though we had to learn, we managed to hold on to that positive thing. I sincerely appreciate you staying until the very end of this story. Of course, not everyone is open to hearing about a trip that is difficult to identify and difficult to condemn. But you persisted. My narrative is about how people sit together in silence and gentleness in the late afternoon, just being there and not saying anything. It has taken some silent and hard turns, but it is the truth, that it is being heard and told, which lightens the burden. I appreciate you staying and your understanding, at least making an effort to comprehend the unexpected. Reports from Team Daily.